In 2014, 17-year-old Conrad Roy killed himself by connecting a generator to his car exhaust system, running the generator, and sat in the car while fumes overcame him. When cops investigated, they discovered hundreds of text messages from Conrad's girlfriend, Michelle Carter, in which she strongly encouraged him to kill himself, even chiding him for his weakness when he expressed doubts about going through with it. Now, Carter is on trial for involuntary manslaughter in Massachusetts, and the text messages are the center of the prosecution's case. The text messages are really hard to read, to listen to, and the trial is online. You can listen to it. It's fascinating stuff. But the media's messages begin on the morning that Roy killed himself, when Carter wrote to him at 6:30 in the morning saying, "The more you push it off," speaking of committing suicide, "the more it will eat at you. All you have to do is turn the generator on and you will be free and happy." Roy pushed back, worried about the effects the suicide would have on his family, and Carter responded, "I'm frustrated because you always say you're going to do it, but you don't. But last night I know you really wanted to do it, and I'm not mad. Well, I mean, kind of, I guess, just because you always say you're going to do it, but you don't." Roy pushed back again, wondering about the method of suicide and whether it would cause pain and if it was effective, and she responded, "Just take some Benadryls just in case," assuring him that he wouldn't fall asleep and die peacefully, which she said is the best way to die. Finally, at 6:25 p.m., when Roy informed Carter that despite his promise to kill himself earlier in the day, he still hadn't left his house, she said, "You just have to do it like I said. You can do this. You can't keep living this way. You just need to do it like you did the last time." Apparently it was a suicide attempt, a failed one before. "And not just think about it, and just do it, babe." Later that night, Conrad Roy did what Michelle Carter asked him to do. He killed himself by exhaust asphyxiation. And Derek's about to tell you why, despite the horrific facts in this case, as a matter of law, she might not be guilty. I'm Jason Beckerman.
And I'm Derek Kaufman.
And this is Behind the Bar. Derek, justify your position on this.
Well, you really built it up.
I stacked the deck.
I want to start with a caveat. This is haunting. I mean, This is as close to an anti-suicide hotline as you could imagine. The facts here are pretty grotesque. I mean, and Michelle Carter some of the texts are taunting him almost. Some are gentle encouragement. The use of the term babe, it's a term of affection. It feels very odd. What I don't think has been committed here, though, is a crime, at least not the crime that they've accused her of, which is involuntary manslaughter. It's a big offense, Jason. These are the types of punishments that come with 10, 15, 20 years, sometimes sentences. And I think what she did here, while in my opinion, grotesque, doesn't arise to that kind of crime. Now, there are cyberbullying statutes. I think those could certainly be invoked here. The punishments are much less severe.
She hasn't been charged with that. What she's in charge with is involuntary manslaughter.
She's been charged with involuntary manslaughter. So when we think about manslaughter, this is what you charge someone with when you don't have the intent to kill. So the classic manslaughter is how we punish people for, quote, wanton or reckless behavior that results in someone's death. So think about a guy who has so many drinks, he has no intention of hurting anybody, but he gets in his car anyway, hits a pedestrian, and kills him. That's a classic involuntary manslaughter. No intent to kill, but a death results.
One other example I think our listeners can relate to is, remember when, I believe it was Bruce Jenner, not yet Caitlyn Jenner at the time, Bruce Jenner was driving in his car and killed somebody by rear-ending them, forced them into oncoming traffic on PCH, and they died, and there was some allegations they may have been text messaging at the time.
Right.
That would be a negligent act while you're driving. You rear-end somebody. There's a good message for anybody who's listening out there. Don't do this. Text messaging while driving, rear-end somebody, and there was an accusation that he may have committed involuntary manslaughter. He eventually wasn't charged for that, but that would have been the crime that would have fit that act had it occurred.
That's right. So it's called involuntary manslaughter. Sometimes there's a guy in the sweat lodge case. You remember that guy who invited a bunch of people for a sweat lodge. He was eventually convicted of something called negligent homicide in Arizona for inviting people in to a situation that ended up killing some of them. Here, I think it's an awkward fit, and I'll tell you why. I think what Michelle Carter did was clearly intentional. It seems as though she wants him to commit suicide. There's nothing gross or negligent about her conduct. It is her intent that he followed through with this. So what you have here is something more akin to first-degree murder, but they obviously aren't going to accuse her of that because she doesn't have the requisite
volitional act.
Yeah,
right.
She doesn't do anything remotely approaching something that actually killed him. She didn't buy him the hose. She didn't buy him the generator. She doesn't force him. She didn't put a gun to his head and say, get in the car and turn that generator on. What she does is all in the nature of text messages and encouragement over phone calls and actually sort of gently prodding him. Now, I think the difficulty she has and why this feels particularly gross is this was a kid who was facing some demons, right? He had a history of depression and he had previous sort of suicidal attempts. And I think it feels as though she's taking advantage of a vulnerable person, right? Is that what really shocks the conscience and offends you to the extent that you want to accuse him of a crime?
Right. Well, I think there's something, that appears very unfair to this woman getting off scot-free for what she did. And yes, it shocks the conscience. Certainly, I think we both agree that it does. You mentioned that, and maybe this is where this is the sort of the knife's edge or the razor's edge where you and I differ. You said that she didn't provide him with the instruments to commit suicide. She didn't force him to. You said she didn't put a gun to his head. I think that's maybe looking at sort of coercion too on the nose, too pointedly. I think that there is a coercion that can occur when you have a somewhat weak-minded maybe person like this gentleman was, or this kid was, who is susceptible to these kinds of cajoling in a way that maybe a normal person, no, I shouldn't say normal, maybe a stronger person might not have been. We talk all the time about you find your victim as you take your victim as you find them, right? It's the old adage in the law that if you punch somebody in the face, you don't mean to kill them, you just mean to beat them in a fight. What you don't know is they have a pre-existing condition with a fractured skull, so therefore skull fractures and they die. You are potentially liable for homicide for having done that because you take the victim as you find them, whether or not you knew about the fractured skull. Here, she has to take her victim as she finds him. Her victim was being taunted constantly, being cajoled into suicide, and he was a person who was susceptible to this kind of cajoling, and it did, in fact, take his life. Now, I hear you. She didn't commit a volitional act, and that's typically required. The volitional act was only encouraging something, and you have a First Amendment right to speak. It wasn't false speech, not in defamation territory or some sort of fraud territory. She was giving him facts about how she felt, and it's hard to punish somebody for telling him how you feel. You should commit suicide. I think you should do it. I think it's better for you. I think it's better for me. I think it's better for your family. Commit suicide. You should do it. Is that really illegal?
Yeah, I don't see it. I think there's some analogy. We were talking about this before. Do you see any similarity? Charles Manson is serving a life sentence and arguably never picked up a weapon. What he did was become a charismatic leader who was this God, Christ-like figure that people who were drug-addled and very susceptible to sort of cult worship fell in with, and he ordered them to go kill people. And he was actually convicted of first-degree homicide. This feels different to me, though, right? She's not a leader in any way. This is his girlfriend. But does that make it sort of worse in a way that she's in a position of trust and this guy was leaning on her?
There are a lot of variables that way. It may make it worse. I think it does. The fact that they were 17 at the time, at least he was. I think she was 17 as well at the time, makes it, as opposed to Manson, who was an adult and preying on people who were, young adults and things like that. I think in that case, Manson's a little bit worse. The difference, of course, is that he killed himself. Manson's followers went and killed other people. So you have this sort of, these were accomplices in a murder, and that's a perfectly reasonable line, right? Is if I pay somebody or I cajole somebody into killing a third person, I'm guilty of the murder, just like the person who killed that person is.
Right.
But here, it's encouraging someone to kill themselves, and that has a different feel to it. You're more in the sort of the Kool-Aid situation, right, where a bunch of people get into a room and the Jim Jones situation, right, where in Guyana, and encourages all these people to drink the Kool-Aid, literally, and as a result, dozens of people die. And would he have been liable for the crime of encouraging suicide? In that case, he presumably provided the poison that caused it to happen. A little bit different, but not that different.
No, not that different. Look, I mean, he did have the big vats of Kool-Aid, if you've seen any Jonestown documentaries, and there's also sort of this group mentality where they're all there, and it seems more forceful, and it seems like there's a greater conditions of duress than here we have 50 miles apart. These people rarely saw each other. It was his girlfriend, and he really was reaching out for her opinion.
Right.
So there's a sense in which not that he was asking for this, but he was genuinely reaching out and waffling. Now, you would expect someone who was responsible to say, please go seek help. She actually said seek help earlier, but he persisted. And it sounds like a part of her was a bit annoyed and just fed up with him.
Yeah, the place it gets to for me, and where I know that my opinion is going back and forth because I'm not sure where I stand on this, but the place it gets to for me is here's a person who is crying out to help to her. And at many times during their text message conversations, which I recited at the beginning of this podcast, at many times during that conversation, he attempts to back off of it. He expresses concern about how his family will react, concern about the method by which he's going to kill himself is going to be painful. Is it really going to work? Expresses concern just generally about going through with this. Is not sure he wants to do it. At every turn, she gives him the psychological mechanism to overcome those concerns. And much like sort of, I don't think
But no one would say she has a duty to seize on those to talk him down from the ledge.
Well, let me ask you this. Could she, let's say somebody wants to kill, I have a gun legally. Let's assume I'm in a place where I have a handgun legally. And there's nothing illegal about me providing that handgun to a third person. Let's take that as a hypothetical. A person says, I'm going to kill myself and I'd like your gun to do it. And I hand that person my gun and say, go nuts. Am I liable potentially for involuntary homicide at that point?
I think so, when you've provided the means to do it, even if you've given them legally.
What's the distinction that you're drawing between a gun and the psychological means by which to do it?
I think the instrumentalities matter. I think the physical instruments used to cease biological functioning for a crime like manslaughter or murder are essential. You need something that could end life. Could the generator... Now, in your hypothetical, could she give him a generator knowing that he was susceptible to misusing the generator to inhale carbon monoxide? That's a closer call, right? Because he could say, I want a generator. I'm also really depressed, but I got some yard work. Do you happen to have a generator on you? Does she have a responsibility to look into his psyche and not allow him to borrow her generator? Well, it's going to get really tricky.
No, I mean, look, if he says I want that generator for the purpose of killing myself and hooking up to my car, then we're directly into the providing the gun situation. But I'm not sure that I see the difference in the distinction that you're drawing between the physical mechanism to kill oneself and the psychological mechanism to kill yourself. I certainly understand the words you're using, and I understand the difference in type. I'm not sure it's a difference that matters necessarily. I think that, if you would say that the Massachusetts prosecutor, state's attorney, has the right to prosecute the person who provides the gun, I think they probably also have the right to prosecute the person who provides the psychological instrumentality to do it. But like I said, this is a tough call.
It's going to be a tough one. I mean, causation is everything in this. And did she cause his death? It's a stretch for me.
There's a lot online about this. And like I said, right now, the prosecution is making their case. It just started yesterday. They have the prosecution's opening arguments are very forceful. I encourage you guys to go look at it. They make this a sick game of life and death, almost like, and I got to say, the text messages paint this picture. And we haven't heard from her. Unlikely we will hear from her. I can't believe she'll take the stand in this case. But they paint this as this woman, this girl, was having a fun time at the expense of this young man's life. That she was just on a lark and she was enjoying the game that she had to see if she could push him to do this. Does that change? Does her mentality in that respect change or alter your opinion, factor into your opinion at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes to the heart of it. I think that's her mentality, and wanting to cause him to commit suicide, to me, highlights the fact that involuntary manslaughter is an awkward fit for this case. If they wanted to go whole hog and say she caused this kid's death, he's so frail, then charge him like you charge Manson, and charge him for
providing the
instrument to. But manslaughter is weird too. Isn't manslaughter the killing of another? I just sort of thought about that. Oh, she killed another. Yeah,
she killed another.
That's right. Yeah. So maybe go whole hog and say she committed murder. I just find that it's awkward. It doesn't really work for me.
There are a couple other legal wrinkles in this. There have been some commentators out there talking about this case who have discussed the fact that Massachusetts is one of those states that allows for physician-assisted suicide. Now, she's obviously not a physician, but if this was a physician that was assisting this person to commit suicide, could they fall within the ambit of those allowances within the law? My guess is probably not. I mean, in order to establish physician-assisted suicide, I think you probably in every state you have to establish this person is suffering from a life-threatening condition, a terminal illness, which is not the case here, unless again we expand the definition of what is an illness from a physical condition to a psychological condition. But the laws typically take those things into account.
Sure.
But there's also this, again, she's not a physician. She doesn't have a right to commit, to perpetrate or perpetrate physician-assisted suicide in any way. So I'm not sure how far that gets us.
Yeah, I don't think it would get too far. It's an interesting wrinkle to all this. I think the other interesting facet of this case is she chose to have a bench trial, and I think that's a stellar move by her counsel, because in front of a jury, she is maybe the least sympathetic person you could have. You can imagine a prosecutor holding up these text messages in front of a jury and pointing at this callous perpetrator of someone who's taken advantage of someone who has a weak mind
so it's often the case.
Person.
The vast majority is. I can't even think of another case where the defendant has chosen to have a judge try their case and be the judge and jury and potentially the executioner as this one. But it's interesting because most of the time, defendants go into a case and what they need to do is convince one juror, just one, that they didn't commit the crime or the prosecution can't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt.
And you want to tap into their emotions by dressing nicely and so forth, having your wife by your side, humanizing.
But here, to the point that Derek just made, right, in this case, it's very difficult to prove involuntary manslaughter, and you need a judge to make the determination. If you have 12 angry people in that jury, there is no way in the world that they're not going to be affected by the emotions in a way that you hope the judge is not. Part of it is the judge in this case is I read a little bit about him, very well respected jurist, and they believe they can get an honest and fair opinion from him and not one that's based on emotion. A lot depends on who the judge is. If you have a judge who is susceptible to emotions, and there are plenty of judges on every bench here in LA, there are half the judges on the LA bench you might not want to deal with because they don't react to things in the letter of the law. They're much more likely to go with their gut or their emotion. And you want to stay as far away from that kind of thing as you can. It lacks predictability. What you want here is, what they have is a very predictable judge who they think will apply the letter of the law, and they think they're better off that way.
Yeah, he's going to see the repercussions of a ruling here for all of his cases and all that he sees. Rather than a jury, he's going to see this as a one-off case. Let's punish this person. I think a judge might have a greater context to apply.
Pretty fascinating case.
Yeah, absolutely.
Parker, what's that sound?
All right, remember to write in your questions and comments to behindthebar@tmz.com. Now, we did get a lot of questions this week, but I wanted to start this off with just a question of my own. I want to know what you guys think of Comey's recently released prepared statement.
So we're recording this podcast on Wednesday afternoon. It's about 2:30 Pacific time.
My printer paper's still hot.
This is
hot off the press.
This came out exactly, I'm looking at the timestamp, 12:27 p.m. So 2 hours ago, this was released by James Comey. It's the prepared testimony that he is going to submit to Congress tomorrow during evidentiary testimony on his conversations with Donald Trump. Derek, I know you went through and highlighted some highlights of this thing.
A couple things stood out to me.
What are your thoughts? Yeah.
A couple things. So little bits and pieces have been leaking out. We're getting sort of more fulsome details here. The first thing that really stuck out at me is Jim Comey, remember, overlap between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. And the fact that he took meticulous notes, he comments on here by saying, I created written records immediately after his one-on-one conversation, his first conversation with Trump, because he was nervous, and he makes a point of saying this had not been my practice in the past because when he had met with Obama twice in person during his tenure, he didn't make any notes. So something about these interactions with Donald Trump and the way things were expressed caused this FBI director to say, you know what, I need to paper this record, and that's very, very telling. I mean, he's describing these awkward conversations. I think the one that stuck out to me the most was this mafia-esque conversation he has about loyalty. So Trump says to him, I need loyalty. I expect loyalty. And Comey says, I didn't move, speak, or change my facial expression in any way during the awkward silence that follows. This is how power is abused, in my opinion. If this is true, power is not abused by directives and angry tyrants banging tables. It's abused in these subtle ways from the position that you have. And Trump, knowing he is the executive in charge, just saying these things is exerting influence. It's leaning on him. You
know, I have to say, up until I read this testimony, I wasn't convinced that we had a case for obstruction of justice. What happened is unseemly, and regardless of your politics, you can't like this. There's obviously pressure being asserted on officials to change investigations based on at the will of the president. You can't have that. It's unseemly. The thing that really caught my eye here is he begins their first conversation, according to Comey's notes, which were taken immediately after the meetings. Trump began the conversation by saying, do you like your job?
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to stick with your job? Do you want to keep this job? And it's not said in a menacing way. It's saying it as a point of conversation. And Comey says that he didn't know where the president was going with this because Comey's appointed for 10-year terms. FBI directors are appointed for 10-year terms.
They're supposed to be independent.
And they're supposed to be independent. They certainly serve at the pleasure of the president. There's no doubt the president has the right to fire him. But the president asked him this question, and Comey was confused as to why he would ask that question. And Comey says, yes, Mr. President, I like my job very much. I like to serve. Later in the conversation, he starts to bring up Michael Flynn, and he starts to say things about Michael Flynn. He says, it was too bad that I had to get rid of Flynn, but because I thought he was a good guy. I thought he was a good guy, but he had lied to the vice president. Trump says this to Comey. He had lied to the vice president, therefore I feel like I had no choice but to fire him. Comey agrees and says, I agreed. Comey says, I agreed to the point that Flynn was a good guy because Comey had relations with him, knew him, and thought also he was a good guy. Didn't say one way or the other about the had to fire him because of his lies to the vice president. I think Comey nobody seems to dispute that Michael Flynn had to go when those facts came out. So after he asked him whether or not he wants to keep his job, later on he then said, I hope, quote, I hope you can see your way clear to letting this go, to letting Flynn go. He's a good guy. I hope you can let this go. I replied only that he is a good guy. In fact, I had positive relations. I did not say I would, quote, let this go. That's what Comey says. So what Comey infers from the president, what seems obvious on his face, what the president is saying is, I hope you can see clear to letting the investigation of Michael Flynn go. And this is where the rubber meets the road, and this is where an obstruction of justice case concerning the Flynn matter will emanate from. And I have no doubt that the Democrats will go crazy about this testimony. They already are, and especially once he gives it under oath tomorrow. Remember, this is just a written letter. It's not under oath. Tomorrow he's going to give the same testimony under oath and say that the president pressured him in to dropping the Michael Flynn investigation.
So this leads, look, this is extremely damning, as you say, for an obstruction of justice charge. Why is Trump not invoking the executive privilege here? I mean, this is horrible for him, no?
So yeah, I want you to give sort of the 2 cents on the executive privilege, but basically, he could have stopped, right? He could stop James Comey from testifying by saying, I assert the executive privilege and I refuse to allow my former FBI director to testify concerning the words of the president during the time while he was serving as FBI director.
Yeah, when lawyers think about privilege, we think about who controls the privilege. And in the case of the executive privilege, Trump controls it not only to assert it with respect to what he said, but with respect to what others say he said in the context of a meeting. So he could clearly say, executive privilege, this would have a huge political consequence for him if he tried to block it, and a legal consequence. So politically, obviously, it looks disastrous. It looks like you're trying to gag someone who has something damning to say about you. But legally, the other party could say, look, you waive that. Trump, in his tweets and so forth, and having his surrogates come out and say what happened in those meetings, has maybe waived the privilege. Waiver works sort of like a tripwire. If you divulge a little bit of that conversation, you can't then say, I want to protect other parts. He's given up, and then if he loses that legal battle, he would have also had the political consequences. It'd be a real disaster.
The real way one of the ways in which he waived, in addition to the tweets, in addition to all the things he said to the media, is, remember, he also spoke to the Russian ambassador. Yeah. Now, he didn't intend for this to get out, but he said it to a third party. You can't preserve a privilege once you've whispered it to the Russian ambassador. But he also says to the Russian ambassador, I'm trying to get rid of this Comey guy. He's what did he say? He's crazy.
Yeah.
He started making comments about James Comey and the investigation to the Russian ambassador. And at that point, Trump's had a very difficult time coming back and saying, I'm asserting an executive privilege over the comments I made to this very same man.
All right, next one up is from Luke. Off the Tiger Woods news, I was curious about the rules regarding the publication of police dashcam videos for high-profile arrests. Like, how often does this happen? Are they automatically made public, or do you have to request them?
I think the media can request dashcam videos, and I think that under Freedom of Information Act requests that the police have to turn those over, and then they are free to be published. Anything to say on that, Derek?
Yeah, I mean, there's certain exemptions that are invoked. Sometimes there'll be sexual offenses where they'll redact the names of alleged victims because they don't want to drag them through the mud and so forth. But Freedom of Information Act is a pretty powerful tool.
Another exception that's used and frustrates often the civil rights folks is that during a pending investigation, they don't want to release because they claim it might jeopardize the investigation. Therefore, they withhold these alleged body cam and dash cam videos when you're seeing an African American suspect being beaten up by the cops or whatever it is.
All right, and the final one is from Brittany. Lawyers often get a pretty bad reputation, something that you guys have joked about before. Has that ever bothered you?
No.
No, I take it as a badge of honor. I think there's a lot of very impressive people who go to law school and become lawyers, and it doesn't bother me in the slightest. I'm happy I went.
There are some real dipshits though too.
Yeah, we're dragged down. There's some real clown shoes guys, but I think the good outweighs the bad.
All right, and that is it for Mail Time.
Thanks everybody. We'll be here again next week with more fascinating stories.
Yep, thanks everyone.
Thanks for watching. If you want more nerdy deep dives into the legal side of celebrity news, hit our subscribe button right here.
And check out our previous episodes over here.